Ever heard the word junkie? I want to say that obviously the use of those words like junkie or tweaker is something that comes naturally to us because obviously we feel a level of responsibility with peers where we want to fit and we want to seem like we're all in tune together. But what we end up doing is we end up creating this weird avalanche that continues to get worse and worse when people continue to perpetuate the message that we've conveyed to someone else. In the work that you will do, because you've already done this before, people are going to tell you things about themselves that are incredibly private. People are going to tell you things about their history of homelessness, when was the last time they were housed, how they lost their housing. And as you receive that information, you will find yourself now in possession of something incredibly sacred and private, which is a person's life being told to you. And because this is work we never do alone, but we do in a team setting, there will be a moment where you will need to share that information with a colleague so that that colleague can say, okay, I know how to get this person connected to detox. I know how to get this person connected to a resource. However, our choice of how we narrate that story to another person will influence that person's wish or desire as to whether or not to be effective or move in a certain direction. On top of that, when a person tells us their story and we are now going to transmit it to someone else, that person has a right to say, you know what, please don't tell them that I was incarcerated. Don't tell them that I was in the service. And I know it sounds odd, but there is a level of us being able to represent another individual through the stories we hear that's incredibly necessary for us to remain in a level of trust with individuals who very rarely have trust. As it's defined up there, and I'll print these out for you later, ethical storytelling, the practice of honoring ourselves and others when sharing narratives, is a practice of recognizing that stories are beautiful, powerful representations of self and that no one has just a single story that can contain multitudes. Again, think of those situations where, I'll think on you two, where you've been involved in the process of housing folks in a setting in Skid Row, or where you were, what part of town?
I did scattered site.
Scattered site?
Yeah.
Where information that was said to you was important because you probably built a trust with someone or a bond with someone. But you know that if you said it to someone else in a way that seemed unauthentic, it might not necessarily generate something helpful or good. And I'll use a more plain example for all of you, except for Chase for a minute. Have any of you ever gone to talk to a landlord to try to convince a landlord to rent to a person that you are trying to help? And the minute that landlord says, here's the word homeless, or the minute that landlord says a badge that says homeless services, right away the apartment's not available anymore?
Yep.
Right away they're like, oh, I think someone else is getting it. Mm-hmm. Really, has it happened to you?
Mm-hmm.
When do you recall? Can you?
Well, mostly was when you said the word Section 8. That's when it was. Oh,
just not even homeless, just the word Section 8.
Yeah.
Anytime I said, where did they live previously? Is it Skid Row? That was a pretty okay, we'll get back to you here. So it's
like don't call us, we'll call you.
Very obvious diversion.
Right.
Mine was when I say they're coming from a homeless shelter, and they'd be like, oh well, let me talk to my manager or let me see what the owner want to do, and it's like a whole. First it was like, yeah, we could rent. I'm like, cause I asked ahead of time, do you take like third party checks and blah blah blah. They're like, yeah, definitely. And then we get there and we saying like, or they offer us like a rinky dink spot with like, rats, roaches, and not proper plumbing because they know it's like a partially homeless person. Like that's the situation that had me mad like a couple of times when I had to go there and I'd be like, hell no, I'm not putting my client in here and I had to advocate for him. But that's happened to me like 3 times. When they just offer you like whatever because they know it's from a homeless standpoint.
The parallel in what you all are sharing, because you've all experienced this at some point, has to do with the idea that we often cling to those things that we think are true, or the things that we're fed to believe are reasonable within this work. And let me just be frank with you. I often say that if you turn on Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 7 news at 3, 4, 5, that news story always starts with blood dripping out of the screen. Someone got shot, person got kidnapped, homeless person threw brick at guy, person caught on video urinating in front of a school.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not realize it, but we start to perpetuate this stereotype around the criminal element that we hear about homelessness, where we don't recognize that the desperation of people to survive will lead them to do anything. The life on the streets is humiliating. When you don't have a bathroom, where do you go, right? I draw this parallel because you may not recognize it, but because we are in this work, we recognize something unique that very few Angelinos recognize. That these are people who are often the victim of violence, that these are people who lack a voice, that these are people who are not offered the same opportunities that the rest of us are. However, it is normal to believe that we want to be safe. I paid for my property. I don't want this investment that I have because I'm retired to suddenly be occupied by a drug addict, by a person who has a history of crime. It is normal for any of us to feel safe, to want to feel a sense of safety. However, we may not recognize that through the choice of how we narrate the story, whether we're Channel 2 News or whether we are an outreach worker who's frustrated, who tells a colleague those people are just a bunch of tweakers, that we start to continue a line where we start to completely destroy any semblance of trust or connection we may have over time with people. We lose our ability to prioritize the lives of the people that we serve, sometimes very, very slightly, by just transmitting a story in a way that's not honest. If Fred told us an hour ago that he's a Clippers fan, and I went home and I was watching the game tonight with my dad, and I said, hey, there's a guy in my class, he's a Lakers fan. That's not true, right?
Yeah, I'm positive.
He's really sure. You don't need to. However,
I am a Kobe fan.
I didn't pay attention. I didn't remember. I forgot. I did 33 things. I maybe got in a car accident between now and I got home. And somehow I missed something that was supposed to be transmitted as truth and just slightly modified it a little. And if that story continues to go, think of the game of telephone, where if I whispered something in your ear and we whispered it all around the room and there were 30 of us, what does it sound like at the end of the room? What happens inevitably is a reduction of kindness, a reduction of effort, and suddenly a simplification of things. As humans, we don't want complex things. As humans, we like to reduce things to things that we can chew on, that we know we can grab. However, when we share a story, there is the need for us to understand that anytime that person tells us something, we will repeat the story to someone else, and when we do so, we must allow that person to have the ability to tell us what can be shared and not be shared. And there are limits. Have any of you been in the act of engaging someone on the streets, in a shelter, in a hospital, that has suddenly told you that they want to kill themselves? You have? You have? There is a moment where those limits run into a barrier, which is the safety and the well-being of the person. That we have the obligation at some point to engage that individual in a way that's meaningful long enough so that we can bring someone with a professional capacity greater than any of us here to do a psychiatric evaluation, to determine that this person needs a 5150. And you all know a 5150, right? I say that to you because, again, I wish I could say that everything I'm about to share with you in this PowerPoint has an asterisk, which is always centered around not just your own health and safety, not just the health and safety of the community, but that person's health and safety. We practice ethical storytelling because obviously we all want to prioritize the needs of the individual that we're going to help. But sometimes the perception of what you think the person needs may be different than the perception of what they have. Have any of us ever found ourselves talking to someone with no shoes, and when you're tempted to ask them if they'd like a pair of shoes, they want a cigarette more than they want a pair of shoes? And you think about what an odd choice. A cigarette is going to disappear in like 2 minutes when they're done smoking it. However, the shoes would ensure that they don't step on glass, that they don't hurt themselves. Yet if I choose in the construct of that conversation to emphasize the fact that this person needs shoes and that I need to go get shoes and that I know I have some in the car and that there's a pair of socks I can get from my colleague, am I diminishing the message they may have? And I know cigarettes is an extremely light example. But you often walk into situations, and I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, where you think you might have figured out what this person wants, and it blows you away that what they want has nothing to do with what you think they should use or that could benefit them, right? Again, every client should be able to decide what they want and how they want their story repeated. I know that from having failed many times in my career, I want to say accidentally and stupidly made mistakes where I know I have compromised the trust of people that I worked with because I transmitted to a colleague the thing I thought was a priority that was not that person's priority. Again, I share this with you because it's important that when we actually employ the ability to listen to the story and to tell it honestly like the person told us to us, we are starting to give the power to the individual. We're honoring their consent, telling us, yeah, go ahead and tell someone. It's starting to say, I trust you. I believe you'll be able to help me if you tell that someone something, and that if you leave out parts of the story that that person wants to include, again, be mindful of what it is and think of your own life. Think of the fact that if you told 5 important things to someone, how would you feel if that person only remembered 2 and manufactured the other 3 because they couldn't remember them, right? It's incredibly strong and very personal for another reason, which is not cited in the screen when you look up here, in that obviously I've said it over and over and over. This is a life in isolation. How many of us have been in the presence of people in the field, on the streets that we've talked to, and they'll openly tell us, you know what, you're the first person I've had a conversation with in like 6 weeks. You're the first person I've made eye contact with in like 2 months. And that shouldn't be unusual. When the mass of the population of LA thinks homelessness is criminal, when the mass of the population of LA will cross the street to avoid someone they think is inherently dangerous, why wouldn't a person who finally has eye contact with a person who's talking to them at eye level want to share, want to say a lot about their story? Have any of you asked a simple question like, hey, can you tell me when the last time you had an apartment was? And then the next thing you find is that you've been there for 33 minutes hearing the person telling you their life story. Has it happened to a few folks here? And there's that piece in our mind that feels like saying, dude, get to the point. Or dude, I don't need to know about where you went to school or what you did. But if we don't, and we start to filter those things, there is a lack of power being provided to the individual. And this is a weird thing. There's limits to this. There's a question I'm going to pose later to you. Is what do you do when the person just won't stop talking? What do you do when you find yourself asking a question that you thought could have been answered with, say, yes or no, and now you're 13 minutes into the story of, you know, everything that they saw or something that happened to them, right? It's challenging. What I'm presenting here by the idea of what we call ethical storytelling isn't a simple concept. It's a challenging one, especially if there's a conditions around you that you are not able to control. What if your colleagues want to leave? What if you're finished at the site? What if you have a time constraint that says that your team is going to be in a huddle in 10 minutes and you don't think you're going to make it because this person won't stop talking? We'll get into best practices that show how to handle those situations, but I want to be clear in that what we're trying to drive home through this presentation is the idea of giving power to the individual to be able to narrate and control their story. Any questions so far? And if anything I'm saying sounds crazy, please stop me. Obviously, you want people to feel comfortable releasing their story. Obviously, sharing the narrative of those we serve is very central to the work we do. I use the example of a 5150, and I'll share this one really quickly. I have a colleague that I've worked with for many years. His name is Anthony Ruffin, and he works for the Department of Mental Health, and he started as an outreach worker. But Anthony Ruffin, I hope you all meet him one day, and I want to introduce him to you one day, is, in my opinion, the expert in the county for how to handle a psych hold and how to go through a 5150 that becomes a 5250 that suddenly becomes conservatorship. And Anthony, in his gift as an outreach worker, knows how to communicate not just with the individual who's homeless, but with the service providers connected. Anthony knows what to tell a social worker at an ER that makes them look closely at this person's medication or to what needs to happen and how it happens. And the reason I share this with you is because, again, you will not recognize this immediately, but I am guaranteed that maybe because you've all been at it for a while, you've started to pick up some aspect of this work that you feel incredibly comfortable in, that you know how to navigate in really well. And it sounds odd because I haven't asked you all this question. In the work we do, there are going to be populations that we feel comfortable with and populations that we don't feel comfortable with. There are going to be groups of people that we gravitate towards because we know how to ease conversation and find a flow with, while there's going to be populations that feel very repellent because they're like, oh, these people always don't like me. They just can't get along with me, right? I'm starting to get into the point of the conversation here where I'm asking you all to use both muscles, to not just depend on that one, but to start to realize that you become greater at the work you're going to do when you get close to an Anthony Ruffin, when you get close to someone who knows how to navigate those things so that you can pick up these skills. Remember, we are good because we steal from each other, because we copy each other, because we mimic each other, right? Ethical storytelling means that each client enthusiastically consents to the way their story is told on multiple occasions. We check each step on the way to ensure that we continue to honor exactly how the client wants their lived experience to be shared. This includes the right to withdraw at any time. One can change their mind, obviously. I'm going to always say that it was my experience in this work that the three kisses of death that were impossible to work with at times were people who were registered sex offenders, people who had been convicted of cooking meth, and people who had a record of arson. That if you were going to try to talk to a landlord or a housing authority or whatever it was to put someone in housing, and your person was one of those three, good luck.
Yeah.
You might find something in the outskirts of Lancaster, in the very edge of Palmdale, but even then it's a ticking clock before someone finds out or catches wind that this person has been convicted of arson, or that has one of those things on their record. And why do I say this? Because there is a level of authenticity that requires us to be truthful and not deceitful to folks. But in doing so, we might find ourselves challenged by the difficulties that we may face with the people that we serve. I always ground this conversation around the idea that we are promoting the vaccine. But I say this because somewhere in promoting the vaccine, you will come into situations that require someone's help that may know something higher than you do. You will need someone with a level of expertise to help you navigate through this. Because I'm sure you've seen that, Chase. Where suddenly you run into a situation where you're like, dude, this sounds like something Joey can help me with. This sounds like something that
Like
Anthony might be able to navigate through, right? And it happens often. But when you connect to that Anthony, to that Joey, or whoever it is, you must not filter or change the information that's being given to you. Because it can adversely affect both positively and negatively. If I omit to a colleague who's trying to house someone that this person was arrested for arson 10 years ago, how long will I be at the housing authority or in front of a landlord before someone catches wind and says, oh, hell no, I'm not doing that. So again, I want to be incredibly careful. Listening to a sacred story requires understanding, trauma-informed work, which we'll talk about. Supporting control, choice, boundaries, autonomy, requires creating space and permission for people to reschedule, take breaks, or end a conversation if needed with questions or pushback. Have any of you ever done a vulnerability index with someone? Have any of you ever done a VI SPDAT with someone? How does it feel when you have to ask the person, have you ever been to prison? How does it feel when you ask a person, do you use drugs? How does it feel when you ask someone, have you ever been diagnosed as HIV positive? Does it feel a little queasy? Does it feel a little weird asking a stranger those questions? No. That's natural, right? What I have found effective in the work we do, especially if we are going to be in the habit of asking questions, which I don't think we'll be here because we won't be interviewing people, but let me just add this for future reference, is I've always found it most beneficial at the beginning of the interview to say, hey, look, Jake, I'm about to ask you 40 questions, and they're going to range from very easy questions to your date of birth to more complicated questions about criminal history. If at any point I ask you a question that doesn't feel comfortable, skip it. Tell me skip it. And you know what? We'll skip it. And by doing that, I'm empowering Jake to control the pace of this thing. I am not interrogating Jake. I'm not holding a lamp to his head and telling him answer these questions, sign this paper. I'm giving Jake the ability to actually control what is being said and what's not being said. On top of that, if I am authentic with the person, I have learned 9 times out of 10 that those questions that they said skip, they will come back to and say, you know what, I can tell you about number 4, or let me give you the true answer about number 10. So I'd use that as an example. If folks question this, please do not hesitate to tell me if your experience has been different with that I'm offering. I'll add another thing. Have any of you ever asked a person experiencing homelessness a question about, let's say, their upbringing, their childhood, a family member, and suddenly they just can't stop crying, or suddenly they just fall into tears because they're remembering something traumatic? Can you remember when or how, or just think of?
There's a client that's pretty well known in the area, the cat lady of the area around here, who, if you like reflect back to some of the like her history, just in general, about like asking about like where she lived and things like that, as far as like, let's say, documentation or filling out any form of application, pretty quickly comes into tears because at different parts of her life she had kids and all of her kids were taken from her. But those weren't the questions I was asking, but because it becomes history and historical for herself, that it'll transform into just like, suddenly you can see that she's thinking about her life in that way, and then you're there for that hour, like you said, where suddenly it was just like, hey, where did you grow up? Arizona. And that's where I had this kid, and that's when they took it away from me, and then you're going from there, so.
We can be very vulnerable.
Yeah.
I mean, again, we are approaching strangers over a series of meetings and asking people very personal information that will help them get aid. However, in doing so, we're not a conveyor belt, we're not a machine. We must admit to ourselves that the person has a right to say, no, I don't want to, or I can't go there. It's very vulnerable, it's very scary to be asked things that are very much connected to things where in your life you think you were a failure, where in your life you think you were harmful. A veteran I'll talk about often by the name of John, who was a ranger in Vietnam, struggled with PTSD for many years in a hill, and used to hear all these voices telling him what a fuck up and a failure he was. And this was a married man who had been a construction worker who had kids, who eventually lost it because of PTSD and found himself living in a hill for 10 years, homeless. And the only thing that he kept hearing in his head over time that he admitted to me was about how he had torched villages of people in, and mind you, this is an old story. This goes back many years ago because I doubt Vietnam veterans are still around. Maybe they are. But my point of the story was that this basically person, through the PTSD they had, they experienced a voice telling them that either he was a murderer, and he was a construction worker. He had a mortgage. He had kids in school. He had a wife. Yet, he couldn't turn that voice off in his head that kept reminding him of the shit he had done to people. And in the process of me interviewing him in the first few visits, because I knew this guy for a very long time, I had to ask, have you ever been in the services? Because it was one of the questions to understand whether or not this person was a veteran. And that was where the floodgates opened. I don't think I've ever sat with someone for so long. And I honestly think that that's all. I started the interview, I'm not kidding, at 9:15 in the morning. I left that hill at 4. Then again, it's not unusual. It's incredibly strong, and it's really hard because you're revisiting past traumas and you're telling them to a person who's telling you that they're here to help, and that you're not sure whether or not this person's trustworthy. But when you find kindness in their eyes and you find a voice that feels reasonable, of course I'm going to tell you everything. Yeah? What do you feel empowered to share? How do you share a client's narrative? Just because something is shared in a conversation between two people, a participant and someone on our team,